Busboys and Poets servers are going to be helping us out throughout the entire program with putting in orders. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion, so make sure to prepare those questions. We're an intimate group, but I can tell you're a lively bunch, and that means we can get to all the questions that you have, so really excited about that. And there will be a book signing after the program, and Freeman's Challenge is here available for purchase. And also, if you are tuning in online, we are live streaming this event. You will still be able to get a signed copy if you just check back in with us after the program. You can just email us at bookevents@busboysandpoets.com and requesting a signed copy, and we'll see which location you can pick that up from. And now a little bit about the book we're going to be discussing here tonight. In the early 19th century, as slavery gradually ended in the North, a village in New York State invented a new form of unfreedom, the profit-driven prison. Untilting incarceration and capitalism, the village of Auburn built a prison that enclosed industrial factories. There, slaves of the state were leased to private companies. The prisoners earned no wages, yet they manufactured furniture, animal harnesses, carpets, and combs, which consumers bought throughout the North. Then one young man challenged the system. And now a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Robin Bernstein is a cultural historian who specializes in the history of race and racism over the past 2 centuries. She teaches at Harvard, where she is the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African and American Studies and of Studies of Women, Gender and Sexuality. She wrote Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, with fellowships from the National Endowment for Humanities and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Bernstein's previous book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, won 5 awards. She has also written a Jewish feminist children's book, many prize-winning articles and op-eds and essays in the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and other venues. She recently received the Everett Mendelssohn Excellence in Mentoring Award. Now I'll invite her up to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Madison. That was so lovely. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to Busboys and Poets for making this possible. Can everybody hear me? Is the sound good? Okay, I'm going to just move this just a little bit. So thank you all for coming. My book is about the origins of prison for profit. So when we think about prison for profit, very often what we think about is the South, and we think about the period after the Civil War. So there's this story that we have received that prison for profit came about after the Civil War as part of a Southern effort to re-enslave African Americans after the end of Southern slavery. Now, there's a lot that's right about that story. The story often hinges to the 13th Amendment. So the idea that is told is that the 13th Amendment, which outlawed forced labor, quote, except as a punishment for crime, this 13th Amendment gave a way for there to be a new form of slavery after the end of Southern slavery. So a lot of that story is absolutely right, but some parts of it are wrong. So the fact is that profit-driven incarceration, it did emerge in the wake of slavery, and it was slavery by another name. But it actually emerged in the North, not the South. It emerged 50 years before the Civil War, and it emerged in the wake of Northern slavery, not Southern slavery. So when we start the story of profit-driven incarceration in the South and with the Civil War, the problem is that we're actually starting the story in the middle. And when we start the story in the middle, what we do is we inadvertently let the North off the hook. So what I wanted to do was put the North back on the hook. I wanted to tell the story of the origin of prison for profit in the wake of Northern slavery as something that was invented in the North and then actually adapted and brought to the South. And the 13th Amendment, what it actually did It did not invent a new form of slavery. What it did was preserve an older form of slavery that had been invented in the North. So I wanted to tell this story, and I wanted to tell it in a way that was really vivid. I wanted to tell it in a way that nobody would ever forget it. So I decided to tell it through one individual, and his name was William Freeman. And if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is William Freeman. He was born in Auburn, New York in the 1820s. And Auburn, New York at the time was a tiny little village in upstate New York. It's in the Finger Lakes area. It still exists. And it was the birthplace of Prison for Profit. It was the home of the original Prison for Profit, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But Freeman was just born there by coincidence. And so he grew up next to this giant prison. And he had, in a lot of ways, he had a really good life. He had a hard life in some ways. He had to work from an early age. But in a lot of ways, he had a good life. If I could have the next slide, please. He grew up in this neighborhood, this community, which is called New Guinea. And you can see this is an 1834 map. And you can see it says Negro settlement on this map. That was the black community in Auburn, New York. And Freeman grew up in that community, and not only did he grow up there, he was actually a very prominent part of the community because his grandparents, Harry and Kate, had actually been the founders of this community. They had been enslaved, and they had been forced to build some of the first non-native homes in what would become Auburn. And while they were being forced to build white Auburn, they also built black Auburn. So this was their community, which they founded. And William Freeman grew up there as part of this beloved and deeply respected community in this tight-knit and warm community. But everything changed for William Freeman in 1840. In 1840, when he was 15 years old, he was accused of stealing a horse. There was no hard evidence against him, but it didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the Auburn State Prison, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about what made this prison unique. Up until the early 1800s, prisons existed in the United States and elsewhere for some combination of three reasons. They existed either to punish people, and or they existed to control people, basically to get them off the street, and or they existed to reform people, basically to help people become better, and often to Christianize them. But in Auburn, New York, a group of white businessmen had a radical new idea. They took these three ideas, punishment, control, reformation, they threw them out the window. They did not care. They had this radical new idea that a prison could actually transform an economy. That's what they were about. At the time, New York State was offering a contract of $20,000 to a vicinity that would build a new state prison. Now, $20,000, this was 1816. $20,000 then is the equivalent of about $500,000 today. So, and at the time, Auburn had about 2,000 people. So what we can understand very easily is that if you take a tiny little village of 2,000 people and you flush it all of a sudden with $500,000, with more money to come every year for upkeep in perpetuity, we can all tell that that is going to completely transform the economy of the area. That's obvious to us. The only reason it's obvious to us is because these men came up with this idea. These individual men came up with the idea that a prison could have the primary fundamental function of transforming an economy. So they put in the bid for this $20,000 to build the prison, and they won the contract with the state. And so then the question becomes, where do they build the prison? So they've already gotten this idea to basically siphon state money to build a prison, but then they get a second idea. The second idea is to build factories right into the prison and have prisoners be forced to work in the factories. So that's what you're seeing here. So I want to point out a couple things in this map. You're seeing a river. This river was everything. This is the Owasco River, the Owasco outlet, and it was a very swift river. They built the prison deliberately on the second swiftest part of this river. And you see they built a dam. That dam was actually in the original deed for this land. It was stated in the deed that the state was going to build that dam for the purpose of powering machinery in the factories in the prison. And this was all planned from the very beginning. So these were factories that were built into the prison. They were run by private companies. So basically a private company would come in, use this factory that was built with state money. They would pay the administration of the prison 35 cents per day for each man's work, and they were all men. And then, so the prison was getting money from the private companies for the prison labor. The companies were getting cheap labor and free water power with which they were making manufacturing consumer goods, which they were then selling at a profit, and the prisoners were getting nothing. And when I say nothing, they were getting no wages at all, they were getting no special privileges, they were getting no early release, they were getting literally nothing. And this was the original prison for profit. This was the first prison that actually was built for the entire purpose of making money from multiple sources and transforming an economy. So if you look at this map right here, if you look at the word state, where it says state in state prison, right above the letter S, it says hame shop. A hame is an animal harness, and William Freeman was forced to work in the hame shop. He was forced to work there 12 hours a day for no money whatsoever, and this is a 15-year-old. And this is how he lived for 5 years. If I could have the next slide, please. This is another image of the Auburn State Prison from the outside, and what's really useful about this image is that, first of all, it gives you a sense of how massive this prison was. You can see, for scale, you can see the trees. This is a massive prison, and by the way, it still exists. I have been to the prison many times. I have been inside the prison, but I've also walked around the prison. And I'm a pretty fast walker. I'm from New York City. It takes me to walk around the entire prison. It took me 40 minutes. So that gives you a sense of just how massive this thing is. The other thing that I find really helpful about this image is that it looks like a factory. It looks like a giant factory because that's basically what it was and what it still is. So you can see these, the smokestacks. Each one of those smokestacks marks the location of a factory inside the prison. So that really shows you the industry, the actual manufacturing that's happening there. And then the last thing that I really want to point out about this image is, it's a little hard to see, but right here, right where I'm pointing, there's a train. And the train was really important. The train tracks were laid down right next to the prison. The prison came first. The prison was built in 1816. And then the train tracks, and eventually the trains were built, they came in later. They were built right next to the prison for the purpose of bringing raw materials to the prison, taking away consumer goods. So it was part of the economy. And the train itself was one of the objects, believe it or not, that was manufactured in the prison. They were actually building trains in the prison. So this gives us a sense of, first of all, the massiveness of it, but also how it was totally tied into the economy of the town and really the economy of New York State. These train tracks were going west, north, west, east, north, south. They were taking people everywhere and taking consumer goods everywhere. So this really shows us how Auburn was growing in relation to the prison. The actual infrastructure of Auburn was growing in relation to the prison. The original concept was that this prison was going to completely transform the town, its economy, every aspect of it, and it worked. As a result of this prison, Auburn, New York became a kind of one-company town, and everybody in the town was economically entangled with the prison in one way or another. And this, of course, bought consent, because the prison was doing terrible things. The prison was stealing people's labor. The prison was enslaving people, and that was the actual word that they used. They told prisoners, "You are now a slave of the state." That's the actual language they used. And this was in the North. As slavery was ending in the North, this new form of slavery was beginning in Auburn, and consent had to be bought. And the way consent was bought was by entangling everybody economically in this prison. So William Freeman, who has been born free, who has been living his entire life in freedom, who is from a family that was formerly enslaved, but had gradually been emancipated and had come out of slavery over a period of several decades. He is a member of the first generation in his family that's entirely free. He's accused of stealing the horse. He lands in the prison, and he's told, "You are now a slave of the state." And William Freeman was furious. And he resisted. And, this massiveness, this is what this 15-year-old kid resisted. And it wasn't just the massiveness of the prison. He was challenging the entire town, because the entire town was dependent on this system. And he challenged it, and he challenged it first with words. And what he did was he said he didn't want to work. And he said that he didn't want to work because he had committed no crime. And he also said that he did not want to work for no wages. He had a self-conception of himself as a free person and as a citizen who deserved to be paid for his labor. So he was outraged that his labor was being stolen from him with no compensation. So he resisted while he was in the prison, and as you might imagine, the retribution was truly terrible. And he suffered terrible violence as retribution for his resistance. After he got, in one of the worst moments, a guard beat him over the head with a board and beat him so severely that he suffered a brain injury, and he also became deaf. After he was released from prison in 1845, he's now 20 years old. He's now brain injured. He's now deafened. And he continued to challenge the prison. He waged a legal campaign to recover what he saw as back wages that had been stolen from him. So he tried to wage a legal campaign, and he was laughed at, and he was dismissed. He didn't get anywhere. And then, after 6 months of trying to wage this legal campaign, William Freeman turned to violence, and he committed a murder. And when I say that, I'm not giving away anything in the book. It's in the title of the book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. When he had been speaking, when he had been pursuing legal means, it was possible to dismiss him. But then when he committed a murder, it was no longer possible to dismiss him. Everybody had to deal with what he was saying, but nobody wanted to deal with what he was saying because he was challenging the prosperity of the town. He was challenging the town's core identity. So they had to shut him up. And the way they shut him up was by putting him on trial. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the trial got really big, really fast, in part because it involved celebrities. So William Freeman was defended pro bono by William Henry Seward, who at the time was best known for being the two-time governor of New York State. He was also a lawyer. So the recent governor of New York State steps forward to defend him pro bono. And meanwhile, the prosecution was John Van Buren, son of President Martin Van Buren. So this trial became a big deal in the news very quickly. It was called the trial of the half century. And in the trial, remember, everybody is economically entangled with the prison. Nobody wants to hear the challenge. They're all invested in shutting William Freeman up, including William Henry Seward, who was totally entangled not only economically but also politically with the prison. So he was more invested than anybody in shutting up William Freeman. So what Seward does is he defends Freeman using the insanity defense. He says that Freeman's charge against the prison is insane, that it is 100% irrational, which of course it's not at all irrational to want to be paid for your work. But this had the effect of shutting up William Freeman and dampening his claim. So if I could have the next slide, please. But then, in the wake of this act of shutting him up, something extraordinary happened, which was that Auburn actually became the site of abolitionist activity. So this is just one example. Frederick Douglass, who had been touring in New York State for years, but had never spent any time in Auburn, right after the trial, Frederick Douglass starts coming to Auburn on a regular basis, and he's lecturing. And you can see right here, the second volume of his autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he chooses to publish the first edition of it in Auburn. He didn't have to do that, and he didn't do it before William Freeman, but then he started doing it. And a lot of other black abolitionists started coming to Auburn and making Auburn a center for abolitionist activity. Harriet Tubman moved to Auburn in 1857, and she chose Auburn to spend the rest of her life as her home for herself and her family for the rest of her life until she died in 1913. So Auburn, in the wake of this terrible, traumatic trial, didn't close down the prison, but it did become the home for a new kind of freedom making in the wake of this new kind of unfreedom. So there's this really unexpected paradox here, and I'd love to talk to you more about that. But if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Auburn prison still exists, and I was in there just a few months ago, and it still exists. It is today the oldest continually operating maximum security prison in the United States. It is also still a site of manufacturing. It still has factories built right into the prison, right by the side of that river, although of course it's not running on water power anymore. Today, Auburn prisoners work, they manufacture office furniture, and they manufacture license plates. So every single New York State license plate is manufactured in the Auburn prison. So if you have ever seen a New York license plate, that individual license plate was manufactured by a man who was literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. If I could have the next slide, please. And there are people today working to change this system of forced labor in New York State. Today, prisoners are not forced to labor in the same way that William Freeman was. Freeman was forced under immediate physical threats. But today, that's not the case, but they are coerced in other ways, and I can talk about that. But there is a movement afoot to change the New York State Constitution. The New York State Constitution has the same language that the 13th Amendment has. It says it has that loophole that forced labor can happen in the case of as punishment for a crime. But this is a wonderful group that I've been working with, 13th Forward. Oh, it looks like it got a little messed up. I'm not sure why that happened. 13th Forward is is an organization that is trying to eradicate forced labor of all kinds in New York State, including in prisons. So 13th Forward is forwarding 2 bills right now. One is called the No Slavery in New York Act, and if it passes, it will outlaw forced labor in any location in New York. It will not eliminate the opportunity to work in prisons, because lots of people in prisons want to work, and they want to work for the same reasons that those of us who are not incarcerated want to work. So it won't take away work, it'll simply take away the possibility of being forced to work. And then there's a second bill that's under consideration called the Fairness and Opportunity Act, which, if it passes, it will guarantee that for people who do choose to work in prisons, they will earn a fair wage and they will have reasonable working conditions. These are exactly the things that William Freeman was agitating for back in 1845 and 1846. And we have the opportunity today to actually finally hear William Freeman's challenge and bring about some of the changes that he was calling for. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for being here and for listening to the story of William Freeman. And I would love to answer your questions.
I'll open it up for questions. You can raise your hand and I'll come past you the mic so the live stream can hear as well. I'll get to this person and then come back up here.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I'm curious, what are the thoughts in the process of what is a fair wage? We're all a contingent from the state of Washington, and we work. We're librarians, and we provide library services to incarcerated individuals. And in the state of Washington, they decided that $1 an hour was fair wage, which seems really, really unfair. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about how we assess what fair wages are and how they really get fair.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the Auburn prison today, the people who manufacture license plates earn 65 cents an hour, which to me certainly does not count as a fair living wage. I was incredibly fortunate to go into the prison a few months ago, and my press, the University of Chicago Press, was very generous and donated 70 copies, 70 copies of my book to people who are currently incarcerated there and who are enrolled in school, who are enrolled in college through a program with Cornell University. And so I was talking with them about their wages. And one thing that I asked them, I told them about William Freeman and his experience of their prison. And I asked them, what in your experience is similar to or different from Freeman's experience? And one thing they talked about was the commissary, that not only do they have these very, very low wages. On the one hand, Freeman was paid nothing, and they are paid 65 cents an hour. But one really important difference is that Freeman did not have to buy the necessities of life, whereas in the prison today, they have to buy things like toothpaste and underwear, things that are necessary simply to keep your body going. So the question of what is a fair wage is related also to the question of what does one have to spend to be in prison. So certainly $1 is not fair, and 65 cents an hour is not fair. And you brought up the library. One young man at the Auburn prison, he actually broke my heart. He told me that he didn't want to work for Corecraft, is the name of the company that that manages all prison manufacturing in New York, including the license plates and the furniture. He told me he didn't want to work for Corecraft because he had a strong critique of Corecraft, and what he chose to do instead was to work in the prison library because he believed in books and he believed in libraries, and it was a mission he could believe in. But because he works in the library, he can't earn the maximum wage of 65 cents an hour. He was earning 16 cents an hour because he was choosing to bring books to other prisoners rather than to make license plates. So, yeah. Yep. Right. Exactly. Yeah, yeah, it's a terrible system. I will say one more thing in answer to your question about fair wages. The state of Maine is doing something really interesting right now, and it's not perfect, and it's experimental right now, but I'm keeping my eye on it, and I invite all of you to keep your eye on it too. What Maine is doing is it's working with companies outside of the prison that are able to hire tech workers remotely. So these are companies that are hiring tech workers who are not incarcerated, but they are making deals with the prisons where where a small number of prisoners who have the skills can apply for these jobs the same way that a non-incarcerated person would apply. And if they get those jobs, and some of them are getting those jobs, they're getting the same wages that non-incarcerated workers are getting. The prison is taking some money out for room and board, quote unquote, but most of the wages are going directly to the prisoners. And then what that means is that, first of all, they're able to save that money if they want to. They're able to send it home to their families. The number one use of that wage is actually for child support. If you're earning 65 cents an hour, you cannot pay child support. If you're earning a tech wage, you can, and they do, pay child support. They are also able to build up a real resume with real skills. And then when they leave the prison, they have a real resume that they can use to get more tech jobs. So this is, to me, a really exciting development, and I'm keeping my eye on it. Let's see how it goes. I think it's really exciting. So thank you for that great question.
So I have more of a historical question, which is around the adoption of the prison for profit. So you had said that at the time, most prisons were about, control or protecting the citizenry or reformation. And I imagine to some people, especially those who are involved in reformation, this idea of prison for profit would be against their moral code. And yet today, prison for profit doesn't seem like such a radical idea. And so I'm curious about what kind of resistance there was along the way to this idea and how it became so mainstream.
Yeah, that's a great question. There was some resistance. At the time, there were basically two rival systems. There was the Auburn system, which is what I've described, and then there was the Pennsylvania system. The Pennsylvania system was created by Quakers, and their idea was that what was most important in a prison was reformation and Christianization. So their innovation was to use solitary confinement. So they basically took prisoners, put them into solitary confinement close to 24/7, put them in there with just maybe some piecemeal work to do, basically to ward off idleness, and a Bible. And the concept was that a prisoner would be put into solitary confinement, they would read the Bible, they would do some piecework which would teach them good discipline, and they would think about what they did and they would regret it. They would be penitent. But of course what we know is that solitary confinement is torture, and solitary confinement does not cause penitence. Solitary confinement causes mental illness. And that's exactly what happened in Pennsylvania. One thing that I left out was that the Auburn State Prison also used solitary confinement. All of its prisoners were put into solitary confinement every single night, and that is still true. That is still the case. And in these solitary cells, they were built so that prisoners could not see or hear each other at all. During the day, they were marched into the factories in total silence. The prisoners were not allowed to speak at all, ever. And it's very hard to take that in. But that was the case. So when William Freeman entered the prison at the age of 15, he was told, basically, you are not going to speak another word until you're 20. It is so hard to take that in. So when I said that William Freeman spoke up and said that he didn't want to work, part of his bravery was simply in speaking. If he had said good morning, he would have been beaten. But instead, he said he didn't want to work. So this was quite amazing. So to get back to your question, there were these two rival forms with totally inverted goals. The Pennsylvania system was trying to reform people and driving people mad. The Auburn system was trying to make a profit and was also driving people mad. So there was rivalry between these systems, which is also a rivalry about the question of what a prison is for, what a prison should do. But Auburn won big time, in part because of the dollar signs. And so the Auburn system went far and wide, and it went really fast. It spread really fast. So first, there were other Auburn-style prisons built in New York State. The best-known one is Sing Sing. Sing Sing was built on the Auburn model. Then the Auburn model spread beyond that. It spread across the Northeast. It spread to the South. It spread to the West. And now a lot of the prisons that we know best, that are most notorious, they were built in the 19th century explicitly on Auburn's model. So prisons like San Quentin was an Auburn-style prison, Parchman, Angola, many, many prisons. And at this point, what has spread the furthest is the core concept, which is that a prison can and should be an economic force. That concept is now everywhere. So if I wanted to build a prison in your town, in your backyard, and I wanted to convince you that this was a great idea and you should support it, would I say, you should support this prison because prisons create justice and you want your community to be a community of justice? No, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say you should support this because it's going to bring jobs. And that's going to make everybody say, oh, yes, that's true. I guess it would bring jobs. I mean, I might not like it, but it would bring jobs. That is the logic that was created in Auburn in 1846. And if that idea feels familiar now, it's because the individuals in my book planted that idea in your head 200 years later. That's where the idea came from. And that idea today is inescapable. I can take another question.
Thank you so much. I have two questions. One's a question of just a little question of fact, and the other is a question. I'll start with the bigger question, which is I would really love to know about the seed for you of telling the story. Was there something that you found in an archive? Was there, and then you pulled the thread. So I would love to hear about that. So that's the bigger question. The second question has to do with the 13th Amendment. I'm ignorant about why that exception was written in, and whether it was specifically, and then because what you say about kind of the North-South is very powerful when you talk about Parchman modeled on Auburn. It also makes me think about the history of segregation modeled, Jim Crowism modeled in the North, taken up in the South. Anyway, there's more to say, but.
Yeah, thank you. I'll answer the second one first. So the language of the 13th Amendment, by 1865, which is when the 13th Amendment was created, by 1865, the Auburn model had spread throughout the entire nation, including the South, including the West, including the North. It had also spread to Europe. So at this point, it was totally embedded in the South for the same reason it was totally embedded in the North. And the South had made some adaptations. So in the South, prison labor was more agricultural. In the North, it was more industrial. But the economic model was exactly the same. So the language of the 13th Amendment was a deliberate and completely explicit effort merely to preserve what already existed, to prevent prison slavery, carceral slavery, from ending along with chattel slavery. So it was explicit and completely deliberate. And it was about preserving rather than creating anything new. So the question of where the original seed came from, it was by accident. I found something by accident, as so often happens. I came across a footnote, and it was a footnote that said that in 1846, in Auburn, New York, I'd never heard of Auburn, didn't know anything about it. In 1846, in Auburn, New York, there was a theatrical performance. And in this theatrical performance, a black man murdered white people. And I have a background in theater history, so when I read this, I said, wait a minute, that can't be right. That doesn't make any sense. And the reason that I knew it was so unusual was that in mid-19th century, white people absolutely did not want to see images of black on white violence. It was too frightening. It could not be subsumed into entertainment. And white people wanted not to see this kind of imagery so much that they would actually doctor performances of Othello. They would actually they would rewrite Othello to avoid seeing black on white violence. That's how much they didn't want to see this. But here in Auburn, New York, white people were paying to see this. And I thought, at first I thought it must be a mistake, but once I verified that it was not a mistake, I thought something must have happened in Auburn to make white people behave in a way that was so different from white people elsewhere in the nation at the same time. Something race-shaking must have happened to cause this difference in behavior. So what was it? So of course I started by researching the play itself and the character. It was a representation of William Freeman, who I'd never heard of. And so I started learning more about William Freeman. And one of the first things I learned was that he had been incarcerated in this prison where his labor was leased. He was subjected to convict leasing. And that's when I said, wait a minute, what? There was convict leasing in the North in 1846? Wait, what? Because like so many other people, I associated convict leasing with the South after the Civil War. And so I started pulling on these threads and learning more and more and more, and realizing that William Freeman had been painted for almost 200 years as somebody who was just completely irrational, who killed for no good reason. And the more I looked, the more I researched, the more I realized that he had a very important moral claim and that it had been suppressed. And that's when I knew I had to write this book.
Questions before we wrap things up? Let me check the live stream to see if we have any on here as well. Looks like they're a little shy today, but that's okay. We have time for one more. Is there anyone I missed? Okay, I'll go first.
I was going to ask the question about Europe. I mean, what was Europe before the Auburn model? And then you said Europe took up that model, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, I can't hear you very well. Did you say
sorry.
what was the model in Europe? Is that what you're asking?
Well, sometimes in different areas.
Okay, that's better. You mentioned Europe, and I was going to ask what was going on in Europe before Auburn or at the time of Auburn, and then you mentioned that they took up the models. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the European model was basically about punishment and/or control, to a much lesser extent about reformation. Europe also had a much more elaborate system of things like debtors' prisons. But that wasn't about turning a profit. That was about extracting some sort of value from prisoners but it was conceived as making up for their individual economic debts. So that's kind of a different model. But yeah, Europe was basically on the model of punishment, basically. And then there were numerous envoys from Europe. One thing that I want to really hit on is that the Auburn State Prison made Auburn internationally famous. So it wasn't only a source of economic power, it was also a source of identity, it was a source of pride. And a big part of that pride was that officials were coming from Europe to tour the Auburn State Prison and then report back. So probably the most famous person who came from Europe was Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to Auburn in the 1830s, and he reported back, and he also went to the Pennsylvania prisons to observe their system, and then he reported back to France, and he was very equivocal. He basically said that they both had merits and that they were both better than what was happening in France at the time. So the rivalry between the Pennsylvania system and the Auburn system was especially important in Europe. And in Europe, the system that ultimately, in the 19th century, that dominated was the Pennsylvania system, whereas in the United States, the Auburn system dominated. Today, of course, the core concept underlying the Auburn system is everywhere, including Europe.
I have a question about audience reaction to the book. Because what you're asking audiences to do is to hold two things simultaneously. The fact that William Friedman had a very strong moral claim to getting paid for his work. And at the same time, William Friedman killed people, killed a baby. He did horrible things. And it feels like our media today, our overall zeitgeist is people are right or wrong.
Yeah.
You know, they're good or bad.
Yeah.
And yet you're asking people with this book to consider the complexity of this human being.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about the reactions to that and to this book.
Yeah, that's been really interesting and really hard. So I haven't told you who William Friedman killed. William Friedman killed 4 people who did not have a direct relationship to the prison, did not have a direct relationship to his incarceration. And that's part of what made the challenge to the prison so terrifying. If he had simply killed, let's say, the guard who had beat him and deafened him, in some ways that would have been a lot more comfortable for people at the time and also today, because you could say, okay, well, you know, it was simple revenge, it was retribution. But instead, he killed 4 people who were in a lot of ways random. There was really no good reason why he killed them and not somebody else. And the argument that I make in the book is that this is exactly why it was so terrifying. What he did by killing random people, it was basically an act of terrorism. And what we know about terrorism is that it terrifies people. It gets attention. It is difficult to slough off. So the question that terrorism always raises is, why did that person die and I didn't? And the answer is, there is no reason. And that's really disturbing. And that's what he mobilized to challenge the prison. There was no easy narrative for the murders in the 19th century or today. So to answer your question, a lot of people have had difficulty with that today. And they find it really disturbing that he killed people who did him no harm. And I'm not trying to defend his action. What I am trying to do is listen to it. I'm trying to understand what he did, why he did it, and most important, what the effects of it were. So, but it's a morally complex story. He's not a hero. He's not an anti-hero. He's a person who had a very important moral claim. He's a person who committed terrible violence. He's a person who suffered terribly. He's a person who caused other people to suffer. And the point that I'm making in the book is that he demands our attention, and we should listen to what he had to say.
Another question? No problem. It's a great conversation.
The title of the book is Freeman's Challenge, so kind of intentionally drawing us to think about his critique.
Yeah.
More than anything. And I'm wondering if you could say, without maybe giving too much away, say more about, because in some ways it sounds like you're saying it's not even just that the kind of gives us a new historical vantage, but it's like the story is his challenge. And I'm wondering, like, if you could say more about the basis of his critique, like how deep it went, because I'm also thinking about, critiques of capitalism, the idea of, the wage as a form of slavery.
Yeah.
So do you have I mean, I don't even know what record he left behind, how well you can tell what the depth of his critique, what he was saying.
Yeah. Yeah, his critique was very narrow. And I think the narrowness was actually part of the power of it. What he was saying was, I want to be paid for my work. And that was actually all he was saying. He wasn't saying abolish prisons. He wasn't saying abolish this prison. He wasn't saying abolish prison labor. He wasn't even saying pay anybody else. He wasn't saying pay all of us. He was saying pay me for my work. And I think the narrowness of the claim is actually part of what was so powerful about it. That he was challenging people to look him in the eye and say, you do not deserve to get paid for your work. You are a slave of the state, which is what they did say to him. And so the narrowness, I think, was actually a really important part of the challenge. There was a part of me when I was writing this, I wanted him to challenge all prisons. I wanted him to challenge capitalism. But no, he was just making this very narrow, direct claim, but I think that's actually part of the strength of it. He was saying one thing over and over, and when he committed murder, that was the idea behind the murder, that he deserved to be paid for his work. One idea.
Did he ever explicitly connect that to his family's history of enslavement?
No, he never did, and not explicitly. To me, one question is, why did he fight back and other people didn't? Well, other people did fight back, but they didn't fight back in the same way that he did. They didn't fight back as spectacularly as he did. But other people did resist. Of course they did. But he resisted in this really powerful way. I think it was connected to his family history. I can't prove that. He never said that. What William Henry Seward did was he argued that Freeman did this because he was simply insane. There was nothing wrong with the prison at all. He was simply insane. But that raised the question of, why was William Freeman insane? And Seward came up with a novel answer to that question, which gives me chills. His answer, one of his answers, was that William Freeman had been driven insane by, get ready for it, racism. That basically a lifetime of discrimination before the prison had driven William Freeman crazy, and that was why he committed this murder. Now, this has incredible reverberations, because the implication is that if a person can be driven insane by racism, then that raises the idea that all people who are subjected to racism are vulnerable to becoming William Freeman. This is a profoundly racist argument that William Henry Seward used to defend Freeman. Meanwhile, Freeman never once said that he was challenged, that racism had anything to do with what he said or what he did. Freeman never claimed racism as a cause of his actions. Seward made it up whole cloth. And the logic that Seward pursued was basically that racism damaged the black community and that the black community did not have the ability to protect itself, to be productive within this situation of racism. He basically made the the tangle of pathology argument that would then become the centerpiece of the Moynihan Report in 1965, 120 years later. Basically, William Henry Seward rehearsed the Moynihan Report in 1846. So this is one of the origins of this particular strand of racism in American culture, this idea that there is something inadequate in black culture. That was an argument that originated in part in William Freeman's trial.
Any last questions? If not, we can clap it up and give it up one more time for Dr.
Thank you so
Bernstein.
much. Thank you so much, and thank you, Madison, and thank you, Busboys and Poets, for this wonderful venue. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you all also for joining us for the discussion one more time, and also want to remind you that Freeman's Challenge is here available for purchase. We know you can get the book anywhere, Amazon, those other places, but Bezos doesn't need any more money, we know that. So if you are going to get the book, we do encourage you to get it here with us. It is a special opportunity, as Dr. Bernstein is here to sign copies as well. So there's such a wealth of knowledge in this book, as we know, so you might also know someone who would benefit from having it. But other than that, we hope to see you again at another one of our events. And have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.